This interview is being conducted on behalf of the Health Physics Society History Committee. I am Eric Abelquist, former archivist of the History Committee, and I'm here with Roger Cloutier today. Today is Monday, November 12th, 2001, and we are going to recap the illustrious career of Mr. Roger Cloutier. I should state that we are currently sitting in the Lab Road facility of Oak Ridge Associated University's training facility, and of course this is Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Roger, let's begin with some introductory material concerning where you were born and where you grew up.
Well, I was born in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, which is about 50 miles south of Boston, which accounts for my Boston accent. I was born July 25th, 1930. Now that's 2 years later is when Chadwick discovered the neutron, but I don't recall it at all. In 1938, when fission was discovered, I was 8 years old, and I don't recall that at all. But when December 7th, 1941 occurred in the Pearl Harbor, I do recall that attack by the Japanese because my brothers were all called up to the service.
What do you recall specifically about the occurrences in both Nagasaki and Hiroshima?
Well, Nagasaki and Hiroshima occurred in 1945, and so I was a sophomore in high school at that time. I recall all the information was over the radio and the newspapers about all the devastation that was caused and all the people that were killed. But I also recall that the land was totally destroyed and that nothing would be able to grow there in the future.
And you were able to confirm a different situation some years following that.
Well, when I graduated from high school, I immediately joined the Navy. And 2 years later, the Korean conflict began, and I was immediately sent to Korea. During one of the refueling and ammunition reloading in Japan, I made my way up to Nagasaki. And at that point, I could see devastation, but what surprised me the most was that there were houses all over the place, and there was vegetation. So it told me that, the devastation wasn't forever. It was temporary, at least in some ways.
So you completed your tour of duty in 1952, and then you enrolled at the University of Massachusetts. What prompted your decision to attend the University of Massachusetts?
Well, at that time, as I believe it still is, the GI Bill was available. And so I immediately went to the University of Massachusetts because I was from Massachusetts. I enrolled and studied physics and chemistry. Between the sophomore and junior year, I applied for an appointment at the AEC Brookhaven National Laboratory Facility and went there as a summer intern.
And that's where you got to work with such interesting researchers and research that involved radiating plants with the gamma forest.
Yeah, at the Brookhaven, the summer students were assigned to work with senior scientists. And at that point, I was working with a biologist who was irradiating plants in the cobalt-60 irradiation field. Now, there's some interesting things about that cobalt irradiation field. The source was up almost 24 hours a day, shut down only for a few hours each day to allow people to enter the field. I would go into the field and look at the plants we were studying, but I noticed there was a tree nearby, and next time I went in, there was a nest in the tree. And a few days later, there were eggs in the tree. Now, everybody predicted that the eggs would never hatch. But it turned out that the eggs hatched. So they said, now the little fledglings will never fly away. Well, the fledglings grew up, flew away. So much for people who are experts in this field. This is a picture of the gamma radiation field. You can see in the center of the field is the location where the cobalt-60 source was.
Okay, Roger, before we get too far along with the research and the different health physicists that shaped your career at the Brookhaven National Laboratory, I think it's fitting that we discuss an interesting find you had at the University of Massachusetts.
Yes, I met a young lady named Linda, and after knowing her for 2 years, decided to get married. In fact, we were on our honeymoon at Brookhaven National Lab. At Brookhaven, we lived in a Army barracks with other married students that were there for the summer. The other students were primarily from the University of Rochester, and I soon learned that they were AEC Radiological Physics Fellows or Health Physics Fellowship students. I learned an awful lot from those students about what health physics is and what things they were planning to do with their career. Knowing them really helped me later on in my own career.
And so, having spoke with these health physicists, that prompted you to apply for an AEC fellowship at the University of Rochester, where you enrolled there in 1956, and understand that you've worked with some very distinguished health physicists while you were there.
Well, before the health physics program began, I reported to the University of Rochester for summer employment, and there my big boss was Dr. Newell Stanton, but I really worked for people like Paul Morrow and Ken Lauterbach. Well, there I worked primarily on aerosols, and so I got a beginning with the aerosol side of health physics.
And specifically, what did that research entail?
Well, we generated aerosols of various types in exposed animals. So Paul Morrow later on became very well known for the inhalation model used by the ICRP.
Now, I understand that some other researchers that you were able to work with included Dr. Elda Anderson, who you met while doing your work at Rochester.
Well, it wasn't research with her, but Elda Anderson, who was from Oak Ridge at that time, came to the University of Rochester to give a lecture, and therefore I got to meet Elda Anderson early in my career and several other people who were prominent in the field of health physics.
Another benefit of being involved on the AEC fellowship is that soon after you were enrolled as a fellow, the Health Physics Society itself was just being formed, and in fact, the first meeting being in Columbus, Ohio in 1955, you had the opportunity to attend the second meeting of the Health Physics Society, which I believe took place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. When the fellowship program ended at the University of Rochester, that is the academic portion of the program, all the students were sent to Pittsburgh to attend the health physics meeting. And it's at that meeting we all sat very attentively, listening to all the talks. I got to meet many of the people we call pioneers of health physics, and to find out what different people were doing.
And I understand that at that time you ran into Charlie Meinhold.
Well, Charlie Meinhold was a classmate of mine, and so I knew Charlie Meinhold very well. But the next step in the procedure was for all of us to go to Brookhaven National Lab for the practicum, and where we would do practical work in health physics. And when we arrived in Brookhaven, I was told that my family and Charlie Meinhold's family would share an apartment. So I had the good fortune of sharing the apartment with Charlie, learning to know his family. Charlie, at the end of the practicum, stayed at Brookhaven and later became president of the NCRP. And so he continued to serve the profession of health physics very much.
At Brookhaven National Laboratory, while you were doing your studies there, I understand that you had the opportunity to work with a lot of fantastic equipment, including a Cosmotron and the graphite reactor. Can you discuss some of those pieces of equipment?
Well, Brookhaven was a leading research center for the Atomic Energy Commission, and they had built what was called the Cosmotron, which was an accelerator, and because of its name and the time period, you can assume it was a major event. But in addition, it had the graphite reactor. The first graphite reactor was built in Oak Ridge, but the second one was built up at Brookhaven National Lab. Now, after the students got to see a lot of things, they then were put to work on doing practical things. And I can remember having to do radiation monitoring and contamination surveys up in the ceiling of the above this graphite reactor, because there had been a release at some time. But I think the students just liked being at those high altitudes. But in addition, at that point, radioactive waste was being taken out to sea to be disposed of. And the students would get the opportunity to measure the radiation levels at the top of the 55-gallon drums. With a meter in one hand and a paint can in the other hand, you would stand on the drum and you would paint a red stripe on the can if it was above a certain level. I can't remember the level exactly, but like 1 Roentgen per hour. Now, if it was less than that, perhaps half a Roentgen per hour, you'd paint a green stripe, and the things that were less than that didn't get marked. When the drums were loaded onto the barges to be taken out to sea, of course they put the heavy ones, the highly contaminated ones, in the center of the barge and used the other drums for shielding. Now, since that time, people stopped disposing of waste at sea. What they did was stop disposing of it on land. Right next to, or almost near, is groundwater, which is much more valuable to us.
Another important individual that you met while you were at Brookhaven National Laboratory is Mr. William Higginbotham.
Well, Willie Higginbotham was in the electronics section, and we learned that he is the fellow who developed the flip-flop circuit that's used in many health physics instruments. He was an interesting character because he also played in the country band, and one of the many tunes they played was Atomic Power Was Given by the Mighty Hand of God, which was very entertaining. It wasn't until later I learned that Willie Higginbotham had actually played a major role after World War II, because at that time he was at Los Alamos, and he then lobbied to have atomic power become a commercial venture. Now, I have a picture of Willie here. I don't know if you can see it very well. It shows him in an older age. But if you really want to know about Willie Higginbotham, you need to go to the AEC's history called The New World, 1939 to 1946, and look up Willie Higginbotham in the index.
Now, I understand that while you were at the second annual Health Physics Society meeting in Pittsburgh, that you were actively looking to be gainfully employed. I understand that the outcome of that search was quite favorable. What can you tell me about that, Roger?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, that it was easy to find a job in health physics at that time. And I selected, or was selected by, the Westinghouse Commercial Atomic Power Division. This group was responsible for building the first truly commercial nuclear power plant, the Roe Yankee plant. By today's standards, it's very, very small.
Well, working at Yankee Row, it's quite interesting because, as you know, we're just a few years away from decommissioning that plant. It's been in operation for over 30 years. It was shut down, I guess, several years ago. But what I find interesting is that while you were working for Westinghouse, you had an opportunity to work on the radiation protection program for Yankee Row.
Yeah, I was surprised to go back and look at my records to go and find out that the preliminary Yankee plant radiation protection manual was written by myself and my boss, Dick Campbell. So it tells you how long I've been in business.
I wonder how many times that's been copied now throughout the years. I was trying to get a good radiation protection program underway. You also had an opportunity while you were with Westinghouse to work on the Pennsylvania Advanced Reactor, and that was really one of the first breeder reactor designs that our country had researched. What can you tell me about that particular design?
Well, first of all, the breeder reactor at that time was still a concept, and that the Westinghouse people had hoped to build this uranium thorium dioxide breeder reactor. In theory, the uranium-235 would be used to start the reactor, but during the fissioning process, some of the neutrons would be captured by the thorium, and uranium-233 would be produced. So you could almost say that you produce more fuel than you burnt up. The reactor was the loops that we ran were very interesting, but they also introduced some problems. I remember when I first arrived at Westinghouse, my boss, Dick Campbell, would send me out to survey, and so I would go out into the loop area and very carefully make smear measurements every place I thought possible contamination could exist. I would do doorknobs, and I would do telephones and do things like that. Now, when I would then take the results back to my boss, he would examine them and say, "Come with me." So I would follow him back into the loop area, and he would say, "Take a smear at that location." So I would take one. He'd say, "Take one over there." I'd take one. And go back to the counting room and count them, and sure enough, there was contamination. Every place he had me take a smear. It was only later I discovered that thorium dioxide gave off a slightish yellow color, and that you could almost see it wherever it was. And it was at that time I learned that a health physicist has to make use of all his senses if he wants to do a good survey.
Excellent point. While you were still working with Dick Campbell at the Pennsylvania Advanced Reactor, I understand that there was an occasion where there was an emergency and that you got thrown into an emergency response action while your boss was out of town. How did that go, Roger?
Well, somebody's been telling you stories. One weekend my boss went out of town. I knew exactly where he'd gone. And after he'd left, I got a phone call saying that one of the seals on the loop had broken, and thorium dioxide had been spread all over the loop area. So I immediately reported into work and closed down ventilation and notified all the emergency people I needed to, got the decontamination crews working, and we worked all weekend. So that Sunday afternoon, everything was back to normal.
So you had contacted everybody and all your bases were covered?
Well, not quite, because Monday morning when my boss showed up, he said to me, "Anything happened?" And I said, "Well, we had a little problem this weekend. We had a seal break and thorium dioxide was spread all over the loop area. It was all cleaned up. I shut off the ventilation, notified the emergency personnel, and did everything I was supposed to do." And he said, "Well, there's just one thing you didn't do." And I said, "What?" And he said, "You forgot to notify me." Well, even today, it's hard to get everything done right during a period of emergency.
Good point. Now, most health physicists know that the AEC fellowships were administered by the Oak Ridge Institute for Nuclear Studies, based in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So it's no surprise that at some point your career would take you to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. You want to elaborate on how that happened?
Well, the Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies sent out a letter to, I assume, former health physics fellowship students saying they had an opening in health physics. I looked at the job and thought it would be very interesting because with a name like Institute for Nuclear Studies, it should have lots of nuclear events going on. It also was a place that provided the money for me to go to school. So I responded and was successful to get the job. So I reported to Oak Ridge in 1959.
Now, what were some of the first tasks that you were assigned once you got into Oak Ridge?
Well, the Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies had a medical division, and the medical division had taken care of the accident victims that had been exposed at the Y-12 criticality accident in 1958. So there's still some activity going on about the care of the patients from the criticality accident. In addition, it had an active teletherapy program, and unfortunately one of the cobalt-60 teletherapy sources had failed. That is, it had leaked. And so one of my first duties was to assist in the cleanup of the cobalt-60 contamination from the medical division building.
Now, I understand that back then funding was unlimited to set up a instrument laboratory, so you had plenty of funds available to purchase whatever instrumentation you needed to have a state-of-the-art equipment lab. Are my facts straight there?
You didn't even come close. Money was not available for new programs, and since the health physics program at Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies was new, I had to scrounge for equipment. And what I'd like to do is to show you a little bit about the equipment that was being used at that time.
I just happen to have a picture of you working in the early days. Can you explain what we're looking at in this photo?
Well, this picture is, of course, me as a younger man, but it also shows a picture much like the scalers that we have today that count in decades, so you could read them just like today's one, 1,220. However, the other instrument I had to use was an instrument that was a binary counter. It's hard to see on this picture, so I'll show you this older piece of equipment that is in Paul Crane's Historical Museum of Equipment. And it's binary, and if you look up here, you'll see that it has a light that represents 1. The next light represents 2. So with the 2 light on, the 1 light on, that counts for 3 counts. However, it continues on up, and we now have the 16 light on and the 64 light on. Health physicists in the past could very quickly add these numbers up and tell you how many lights, how many counts had been received. This happens to be 80 counts because we have 64 plus 16 plus 2 plus 1. That was quite a job in the early days. Let me just mention something else, and it deals with the fact that in the old days we had to use slide rules. There were not computers, and therefore things were a little more difficult to do. And if you also needed a multi-channel analyzer, it amounted to having a scaler for each channel. We had originally a 20-channel analyzer, which consisted of 20 scalers.
Well, we've certainly seen tremendous growth in the state of equipment today that health physicists use to measure radioactivity. I understand that not only was the instrumentation changing, but when we take a look back in the 60s as to where the radiation protection standards were compared to where they are today, things have changed quite a bit in that area as well.
Well, when I started, the radiation protection standards were much different, as you might expect. And in fact, it was 3 Roentgens per quarter was an acceptable exposure. So things changed as a result of that. The limits were set, in a sense, by the NCRB, but were enforced by the Atomic Energy Commission. However, along the way, people got quite concerned about the Atomic Energy Commission being the sole group responsible. And so President Eisenhower set up a new group called the Federal Radiation Council to advise him and the other federal agencies. It wasn't until much later that the Federal Radiation Council was replaced by the Environmental Protection Agency with the responsibility to advise the federal government and the president.
Now, back in the early 60s, I'd imagine that the general public was pretty much concerned, or at least aware of fallout shelters and just all of the goings-on with the atomic weapons tests. What are your recollections from that era?
Well, through the 50s and the 60s, there was lots of weapon testing, both in the United States and out in the Pacific, and there were atmospheric tests, so there was lots of fallout. In fact, if you were to plot the levels of fallout, it was going up exponentially. This was a problem to health physicists because sometimes contamination from outside the building, from fallout, was tracked inside the building and would set off alarms. In addition to that, the general public was very much concerned about the fallout levels. There were strange little songs that were being sung, like "It isn't raining rain, you know, it's raining strontium-90." So people were concerned. Health physicists had to go out and give lectures to people about how to build a fallout shelter, and so a number of people built fallout shelters, in addition to giving talks about how to protect yourself from the fallout should there be a nuclear weapons explosion nearby. The civil defense people were very active at that time, and the civil defense distributed thousands and thousands of instruments to people, primarily the police department, fire department, in order to allow these individuals to be able to make radiation levels and report them to a central location. You may recall that after the Marshall Island explosion of the thermonuclear weapon, that the fallout covered a very large area that looked like a large cigar, and that several servicemen and Marshall Islanders were exposed as a result of that test.
That's right. It's interesting that you brought along a civil defense meter. Currently, the Health Physics Society is donating civil defense meters to schools to facilitate the science teacher workshop programs. And so, while these instruments were prepared many years ago, 30 years ago, and largely sat in stores, warehouses, that they're finally getting used as we train the next few generations of science teachers into the detection of radioactivity. Another point I want to bring up about fallout and the heightened public concern is that Dr. Ernest Sternglass had quite a provocative article called "The Death of All Children" around this time. How did that go over in the community?
Most people were concerned because it had all the key words, the death of all children. But it really dealt with the development of rockets that could carry multiple nuclear weapons. The article, by the way, was published in Esquire magazine, which was sort of a men's magazine at that time, and it actually was an insert into the issue of Esquire. And so lots of people were concerned about that. But even today, I bump into people whose memory takes them back to the period in the 1950s and 60s and is still responsible for their concern about radioactivity.
Getting back to your work with the medical division at Orange. Now, when I got into health physics myself, I understand that Roger Cloutier was closely working on a lot of the new health physics procedures concerning the use of radioactive materials, treatment of cancer, and so it's just a natural that when I think of the work that you've done, I'd like to talk about, for a little bit, some of the early work you did while you were with the medical division on the use of therapy, radiation, etc.
The medical division was a research facility, including a research hospital. It also was located next to the X-10 reactor, that is the graphite reactor at Oak Ridge National Lab that was used to make lots of radioactive materials. Also in the Oak Ridge area was a cyclotron that could produce cyclotron-produced radioisotopes. And so the medical division was devoted to trying to find new uses for radioactive materials. It was well known at that period of time that atomic energy could be used for warfare, it had been, but also could be used for peaceful uses. So some of the early nuclear medicine techniques that were developed at the medical division of Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies.
Now, who was heading up that division at that time?
Well, the head of the division was Dr. Marshall Brussel, who was a very interesting individual. But what I like to remember about him is he would say that radioactive materials were the safest of all hazards because radioactive materials continuously give off their location by the radiations that they emit, and therefore it's very easy to find them and to quantitate the amount of toxicity, if you want to call it that, present at the time.
Well, the medical division was also state-of-the-art back in the 60s with nuclear medicine techniques, and I understand, well, is it fair to say that they pioneered the use of gallium-67 in treatment techniques?
It's interesting. Gallium was first studied as a therapy isotope, and then later on a new isotope of gallium was studied, and it was found that it could easily identify locations where cancer were located and places where inflammation was occurring. And this became a very valuable tool in nuclear medicine. In addition, the medical division was active in the use of iodine-131, both as a diagnostic tool, but also as a therapeutic tool for people with hyperthyroidism. Now, health physicists at power reactors were interested in having zero release from the reactor. Of course, health physicists at medical facilities were also interested in having zero release. However, we occasionally had patients walking the halls who had up to millicurie amounts of iodine-131 in them. And these people, of course, would dribble here and there, so contamination was quite an issue. I want to mention one other issue, though, and it's a tough one. Occasionally, we would have a mother who had undergone radioisotope therapy, and she wanted to hold her child for just 2 minutes. The rules essentially said it can't be done because you're trying to protect the child. But when you sit down and think about the morality of it, that's a different issue.
That's right. That's a real tough issue. I understand that the medical division also was effective at innovative therapy techniques where high doses were delivered over periods of time to treat otherwise untreatable cancers.
Well, the medical division had done a lot of work with blood disorders because, as even health physicists know from their introduction to radiation effects, that the blood system is easily affected by even relatively low doses of radiation. So the medical division handled lots of patients who had blood disorders. For some of these disorders, they wanted to irradiate them in order to see if they could control the blood development system. When I arrived in Oak Ridge, or soon after, a device called the METB, Medium Exposure Rate Total Body Exposure Unit, was developed. I have a picture of it here. It's a little hard to see because you're looking down a maze, and the bed the patient would be on is located right here, but there's a mirror there reflecting what can be seen here, so you can now see where the patient would be. And in these locations were 8 cesium-137 sources. The sources provide a uniform dose rate of about 1 Roentgen per minute, uniformly across the patient. Now, in time, it was decided that the METB facility was not suitable for some blood disorders. And so Patricia Dalton and I were asked to develop a unit called the LEFB, low exposure. And the low exposure facility had to be large enough so that the patient could move into the facility and stay there for a long period of time because the exposure rate would be 1 Roentgen per hour. That meant if you were going to give them 100 Roentgens, they had to be there for 100 hours. And so essentially what was done is a motel type room was built and suspended in a very large shielded facility. And 10 cobalt-60 sources were positioned around this room and irradiated this room, so no matter where the patient stood or was in bed, the dose rate was 1 Roentgen per hour. Patients would move in at the beginning of the week, and except for the need to go out to use the bathroom, would stay there for much of the week.
What was the total living space? What kind of footprint?
It was about the size of a motel room. It was probably 16 by 16.
One of the issues that come up during the treatment using radiotherapy is the accurate, or as accurate as you can be, measurement of the delivered dose. And I believe I understand correctly that at that time there was a lot of research being done on moving from film badges to the use of TLDs. And I understand that you got to work intimately with one of the researchers working on the use of TLDs to measure radiation dose.
Well, thermoluminescent dosimeters were just then becoming available to health physicists. In fact, most health physicists hadn't heard of them. Now, Jack Beck, who was on my staff, was working on measuring the radiation dose inside of phantoms that would be placed in total body radiators. At that time, Jack had to go and measure the sensitivity of each dosimeter, sometimes before and after its use, in order to determine its response to radiation. He would mark small numbers on each dosimeter and have to then keep track of the sensitivity of the dosimeter and also keep track of where the dosimeter had been placed.
So as a result of Jack Beck's work, we can safely say that the popularity grew, and now that is the standard state-of-the-art way that we measure personnel as well as environmental dose nowadays using the TLDs.
At that time, TLDs were used primarily for higher radiation levels than they are today. And in addition, a fellow named John Cameron was also a great pusher, along with people like Jack Beck.
Now, was there an application with NASA being interested in the exposure to their astronauts as they were traveling in space?
Well, I have to back up a little bit. Total body radiation had been done since the 1930s. In fact, the earliest total body radiations had been done at Memorial Hospital in New York City. And NASA was interested in radiation dose that the astronauts might receive from their travel in space. So along the way, we were asked to go and gather up all the information that was available on total body radiations, including those exposures that occurred back in the 1930s. So several of us, including Jack Beck, worked on trying to gather up all that data. When the data was collected, it was then made available to everyone, but it was also made available to NASA.
One of the things that we heard several years ago was I'll use the term fallout, but in a different context this time, the fallout from a lot of the studies that were done, a lot of the human experimentation. There were some not so favorable reviews of the work that had been done at Orens. What are your comments?
I believe you're talking about the 1990s when concern about unethical exposure of humans occurred. The original work concerned people who were given plutonium because they needed to have information about plutonium, and they thought these individuals were so sick that they would soon die. It turned out that some of them did not die immediately, but survived for several years. That led to studies that required the U.S. government to look at all work that had been done by the Atomic Energy Commission. Now, I'm happy to report that when that group examined the work that had been done at the Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies, which later became Oak Ridge Associated Universities, they concluded that all the work had been done following proper protocol, and there was no reason for any criticism of the Oak Ridge work at the medical division.
So notwithstanding the 60 Minutes story, things were really done according to procedure, and given the emotions that ran high during these trying situations, things were done the best that they could be done given the fact that it was experimentation.
Most patients, I'll correct that, all patients knew that the work being done at the medical division was experimental. In addition to that, most patients hoped that there would be a cure. But most also thought that the research that was being done, if not beneficial to them, would be beneficial to someone else in the future.
So we've already discussed quite a number of advances in nuclear medicine techniques, the LET-B facility, the MET-B facility. So it's only natural that with these advances, in order to share this information, that there would be tremendous opportunity for training, that other physicists would be trained in the use of these technologies. What was your experience in that regard?
The medical division was a very busy place with lots of people coming to see what was happening in nuclear medicine and in therapy. Because of that, we soon developed a training program, and I helped participate in the training program of new physicians or physicians who were starting nuclear medicine programs. My portion, of course, dealt with the health physics aspects of handling radioactive materials, but also the business of how to do dosimetry of the various radiopharmaceuticals that were being used.
Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit more on into the interview. I also understand, getting back to the theoretical research, that you had an opportunity to work with a new particle accelerator that was creating pions, and that there was some interest for applying these pions to particularly the treatment of brain cancer.
The pion business is a highlight of my career, actually. Oak Ridge National Lab wanted to build a new accelerator. One of the features of this new accelerator was that it would have extremely high beam currents. With these high beam currents and the high voltages that the particles were accelerated to, that the beam would produce lots of pions. The pions consisted of 3 different types with a mass of about 270 times the mass of the electron. The negative pion was being considered for radiotherapy. It would provide a very, very high dose in a very localized area, because when it was absorbed into the nucleus of the atom, it would cause the atom to more or less explode. Dr. Frank Comas, who was the radiotherapist at ORU's medical division, and I got to travel all over the United States talking to physicists about the pion, and more important, talking to physicians about the use of pions for treatment of such things as brain tumors. Unfortunately, the accelerator was not built in Oak Ridge, but was built in Los Alamos.
As your career continued on, you found yourself doing internal dose calculations quite regularly, and there would be training symposia and other opportunities to share your knowledge with other colleagues, other physicists that were in the business of calculating internal dose. Can you share some information concerning these internal dose calculations?
During that period of time, physicians were required to do their own internal dose calculations. So during all the training programs we ran, we taught internal dosimetry. Soon we were being contacted by physicians to assist them with their internal dose calculations. And in time, we arranged to have a symposium an international symposium devoted exclusively to medical radionuclides, radiation dose and effects. Now this symposium has been repeated about every 5 years since 1969, and it actually provides lots of the important information to researchers and to physicians about what has been happening in internal dosimetry. There's another symposium scheduled for next year.
I understand that at one of these initial symposiums that you had the opportunity to meet Dr. Edith Quimby.
I got to meet lots of people, but Edith Quimby was perhaps one of the highlights. Edith Quimby had started internal dosimetry at Memorial Hospital in New York City, and some of the very basic internal dosimetry calculations were done by her and Marinelli. I also got to meet Dr. Spires from England, who did much of the early bone dosimetry. So yes, the symposium brought lots of interesting people to Oak Ridge.
Soon, I imagine, there was the Radiopharmaceutical Internal Dosimetry Information Center established as part of the medical division, and that you were the first program director for RIDIC.
The internal dose center kind of evolved, but probably took full shape when the Food and Drug Administration and the Atomic Energy Commission asked us to go and set it up as a permanent structure. Initially, much of the work was devoted to new radiopharmaceuticals that were being developed, for which the Food and Drug Administration had lots of concern. They also required the center to help produce the package inserts that have to be provided with each radiopharmaceutical. The Atomic Energy Commission was interested because it was a supplier of many of the radioisotopes that were being used in radiopharmaceuticals. So yes, the center got a good start. One of the other things that it did, though, was to collect all the data that it could about internal dosimetry and enter it into a computer database. And that database became available to anyone throughout the world. And so lots of the information about dosimetry was readily spread from one country to another.
And that information is still being maintained today?
The information is still available, but I must say that the center is not as active today as it was during the early days.
Now, after running the center for a number of years, I understand that Evelyn Watson took over the reins of the center and took off in many directions.
Assisting me with the center was Evelyn Watson, and when I moved into other positions, Evelyn Watson took over the management of the center. She continued to run the center, to run the symposia, and many of the other activities of the center. She also took over as chairman of the Medical Internal Radiation Dose Committee for the Society of Nuclear Medicine, which I had originally headed up.
In addition to Evelyn Watson running RIDIC for a while, she was also completing her work on the pregnant woman model.
Yes, the pregnant woman model was started sometime before Evelyn took over, but the pregnant woman model was finally finished and now stands next to the reference man model that Walter Snyder developed out at Oak Ridge National Lab.
In addition to the medical division at Orange, there was also a special training division. Started at the same time, I understand. So since the late 40s and continuing even today in some form, there have been health physics related courses delivered. One of those started up in the late 40s and was called the use of radionuclides in research.
Yes, the Atomic Energy Commission wanted to teach people how to use atomic energy in research, and so they started programs and asked ORU to run them for researchers, faculty members, and even students to come to Oak Ridge and to learn how to use radioactive materials safely. One of the early participants in the course was G. William Morgan, and I have a thing here about G. William Morgan because G. William Morgan originally was a health physicist. There's a picture here showing him with a meter in his hand. He was out at Oak Ridge National Lab, but he was with the Atomic Energy Commission. He stayed with them for a while, but then left the profession of health physics and went into real estate. But when he died, he left a large sum of money to the Health Physics Society so that each year the society can bring an expert, primarily from some different country than the U.S., to lecture at the Health Physics annual meeting. So we have a lot to owe G. William Morgan, who started out with a cutie pie in his hand.
I understand that the special training staff consisted of several well-known individuals. One that we probably could talk about included Dr. Elizabeth Rona.
When I arrived in Oak Ridge, I got to meet Dr. Elizabeth Rona, who worked for the Special Training Division. Dr. Rona was a Hungarian who had gotten her PhD in Europe and went to work for the Radium Institute in Vienna. While she was in Vienna, they sent her to the Radium Institute in Paris, and she got to work with Madame Curie and Madame Curie's daughter Irene. Dr. Rona, I have a picture of her, a little hard to see because she didn't like having her picture taken, but this is a picture of her, and this is a picture of her with Dr. Seaborg, who was head of the AEC at one time, but more properly known as the person who discovered plutonium and several other elements. And this is a picture of Dr. Rona with Libby, who is also very well known. Dr. Rona also used to tell a story about that at one time while she was at the Institute in Vienna, that James Chadwick, the fellow who discovered the neutron, came to Vienna to test out a hypothesis that the two institutes had, and it required that those individuals with very good eyesight go into a darkened room and count the scintillations seen on a zinc sulfide screen as alpha particles bombarded the screen. Dr. Rona said that during that period of time, Chadwick was very nervous and paced back and forth inside the darkened room. And he also kept the experiment going on for hours so that the poor people who had to read the simulations were very disturbed. You can read more about Dr. Rona in a little book that she has. Now it came about radioactivity, nuclear physics, and atomic energy. There's also another story about her that some of the women might be especially interested, although I'll recommend it to men also. It's called Their Day in the Sun, and it's the women of the Manhattan Project. To continue the story, Dr. Rona left Europe at the beginning of World War II and came to the United States. She was not a citizen of the United States, but was very knowledgeable about polonium chemistry. And as you may know, polonium was used with beryllium as an initiator in the atomic weapons. So therefore, the Atomic Energy Commission consulted with her on numerous occasions.
Many health physicists owe their first introduction to health physics to the 10-week course offered at Oran's and ORU. Today it's a 5-week course, but I understand, Roger, that you were instrumental in creating the 10-week course.
In the early days, the armed services requested Oran's to conduct several health physics training programs. In time, those training programs became available to others. And during the period of time when the AEC was trying to transfer some of their responsibility to the states under the Agreement State Program, the Atomic Energy Commission asked ORANS to initiate a 10-week health physics program that would be used to train many of the state radiological health people. I had the good fortune to conduct the courses along with other staff members, and so got to know many of the initial state radiological health program people.
As the program director for the special training programs, during the 10-week course, you often had occasion to monitor the performance of the instructors. And there was one particular habit that an instructor had that you thought it would be a good thing to make that instructor aware of a habit that particularly was not a desirable.
Well, many instructors, when they get involved in doing calculations and working at the blackboard, will turn their back to the students and continue to work on the blackboard. I had one instructor who did it quite frequently, so I told him about a dream I had where I was lecturing to the students and turned to the blackboard, and after some time turned around and discovered that the students had all turned their chairs around so that their backs were facing me. He thought that was so very funny that he told his students. And the next day he was in class doing the lecture and started working at the blackboard until he turned around and we took this picture to show what the students looked like. This picture was taken of the event. Behind those bags are some of today's health physics leaders.
We've been talking about the special training division and the creation of the 10-week health physics course, and somewhere along the line it became a 5-week health physics course. But I believe I'm correct in stating that at some point John Fraser headed up that program as well.
Yes, several people have, but John Fraser was one of the key people who headed it up. And I'm happy to say that John Fraser is president-elect of the Health Physics Society at this time.
One of the things that you can't miss when you come to one of these courses is the historical instrument collection that's right outside the room. How did that all come about?
Well, we have to give credit for that to Paul Frame, who now manages the Health Physics Training Program for state people and for other people. Paul initially started collecting a few items, and this grew into more items, and he now is the director of the Oak Ridge Historical Instrument Collection Group, which is partially supported by the Health Physics Society. Now, if you're ever in Oak Ridge, I'm talking to other people, if you ever come to Oak Ridge, you can make arrangements to visit this collection, but you can also find it on the web. And at the end of this program, I hope that we'll show you the web page you can go to. But it'll take you all the way from the very first uses of radioactive materials, both in industry and in medicine, right up to trips to the moon.
Well, going back to the special training division, in the late 1960s, I understand that there was a program called Atoms in Action, where training folks went to small colleges and universities for a 2-week time period to...
You've combined two things because the Atom in Action came a little later. But the Atomic Energy Commission asked the training program to equip a mobile laboratory that would go to the small colleges and universities and present a program. It was a 2-week program with the lectures being given in the college classroom, and then the students would come to the mobile laboratory in order to carry out experiments. In each country, a large inflatable building was installed. The building contained public exhibits as well as the training classes. Many a college student got their first introduction to radioactive material and its possible use in research on one of these mobile laboratories. But because of the success of that laboratory session, the Atomic Energy Commission asked the training group to participate in the Latin American phase of the Atoms in Action program. The staff was required to take a training program in Spanish and to prepare the manuals in Spanish, along with the help of people whose native language was Spanish, to gather up the equipment, and to go to Latin America twice a year, a different country each time, and to put on various training programs. My phase of it was to teach health physics to radiation protection. The program was a one-week-long program, and during the first week, we did laboratory exercises and anything else related to radiation safety. During the second week, I traveled the country with someone who was from that country to view the various establishments that they had. I would sometimes see X-ray equipment that came out of almost the Dark Ages, but also would see laboratory equipment, the newest that you could ever find. Now, there's some other excitement with that program. For example, in Panama, there was a revolt while we were there, and there was a great deal of concern about what should happen. I was thankful that my contact suggested that we travel in a private car instead of the government vehicle during that period of time, so that we would not stand out and be seen. There was another period of time in Guatemala where another revolt was going on, but I must admit, in spite of the revolt, I was able to do my work without any difficulty at all. It surprised me, but that's the way it was then.
Exciting time. I understand that not only were there occasions where the Special Training Division had training staff on the road, as you just explained, going to Latin American countries, but there was also opportunities for engineers and scientists from other countries to come here. And in fact, I'm aware of one instance where there was Iranian engineers and scientists who had planned to come to Oak Ridge for a training course.
Well, the Department of State requested the Atomic Energy Commission to develop and present a course for Iranian engineers and scientists. It was a joint program with Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Clyde Fulmer from Oak Ridge National Laboratory and I got to travel to Iran in order to select the individuals who would participate in the program. It took some time before the program was actually fully approved, but in time the students arrived in Oak Ridge. It was a program that seemed to be going very, very well in Oak Ridge, but things in Iran were not going very well. The Shah of Iran, who was in charge of the country, was ousted. And very soon the students found that the government that had sent them to Oak Ridge for training was not the government in power. The program then had to close, and those students, unfortunately, had to return to Iran and to a government that was not friendly to them.
Returning to the medical division, we can also talk about Dr. Lushbaugh, Dr. Gould Andrews. What were some of your recollections with work with both of those gentlemen?
Dr. Gould Andrews, who headed up the medical division after Dr. Brewster left, was about as kind a person you could ever meet, and very, very knowledgeable about how to treat radiation accident victims. And so the medical division was called upon frequently to provide care for people who were involved in radiation accidents. Dr. Lushbaugh was a pathologist, originally at Los Alamos, and there's the pathologist who was sent to Idaho for the SL-1 accident, and he did the autopsies as best they could be done on the victims of the SL-1 accident. Because of this combination of people who knew about treating patients who had been exposed to radiation and the ability to follow up on what may have happened to them, a group was established called REACTS, the Radiation Emergency Accident Center Training Site. And from that point on, REACTS would respond to many, many accidents. The REACTS program also conducted training programs for physicians from all over the country and the world. And I participated in training, the health physics training that was given. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the accidents that were involved, just briefly. The first accident involved an individual who was on an island in the Caribbean and who had a radiography source fall out of the camera. He immediately picked it up and reinserted it into the camera. There was some concern about the size of the exposure he may have received and what may happen to him. And so he was sent to Oak Ridge for examination. Sure enough, when he showed up, he had a change in his blood picture which indicated that he had an exposure. But it soon became apparent that his principal exposure didn't occur from the lost source issue, but by the way he did his radiographic techniques. He had the habit of sitting on top of the tanks almost in the radiation beam that came from the radiographic camera. And therefore, most of his exposure was to his whole body as opposed to being to his fingers from picking up the radiographic source.
So he was chronically exposed because of the practice he had of sitting almost in the primary beam?
That's absolutely right. But let me tell you a little more about this individual. The camera was not the proper camera to be used for the size source he had, except it was lighter than the source, the camera he should have used, and therefore he liked that one better. One weekend he took off while he was at our hospital, and he rented an airplane. Before long, he crashed the airplane down in Alabama. When he got back and explained what had happened, he just shrugged it off as though, so what? Well, that was his attitude about radiation also. The second case I'd like to talk about involved a teletherapy source containing cesium-137 that was, quote, misplaced. And in time, the capsule was opened and several people ingested the cesium-137. Several REACTS people went to Brazil in order to physically examine the patients. I did not go, but blood samples were sent back to Oak Ridge, and the Internal Radiation Dose Center examined the blood samples. Based on the amount of cesium that was found in the blood, we predicted that the young girl from whom this sample had come would not survive. Most people didn't want to believe it, and so the sample was reanalyzed. It's unfortunate, but I must say that the girl did die. The third accident happened in El Salvador. It's another example of where people walk into a radiation area because the interlock failed. Perhaps many of the accidents that we looked at are accidents where interlocks have been bypassed or somebody found a way around an interlock. But before you jump at and say the people in El Salvador didn't know what to do, you have to remember that El Salvador was in the midst of a civil war and had been for several years. So there may have been some explanation for them not recognizing the fact that the sources were on. 3 people went into the area and almost immediately showed symptoms of acute radiation exposure. They were sent to Mexico for treatment and care. The REACTS team was sent down to Mexico to examine them and provide whatever help they could. I was sent down in order to do the dosimetry. And on a bench in Mexico City, I was given the information from Bob Ricks about the condition of the patients and what little we knew about the accident facility. Later on, I was asked to interview the patients. The first victim had been placed into reverse isolation in order to protect him getting an infection. So I was properly dressed up and sent in to talk to him. It was perhaps the most difficult thing I had ever done for two reasons. One, I already knew the outcome of the patient's exposure. He had received exposures in the tens of thousands of rads to the legs and up near the head in the tens of rads, very uneven exposure. It was pretty clear he would lose his legs and wasn't clear whether or not he'd survive or not survive. But it turned out that he was very lucid, and in spite of my rudimentary Spanish, he was able to communicate with me what had happened and where he stood, and possibly what the outcome of the exposure would be. The results of that is published in an IAEA publication, and this is the picture of his legs, which gives you some idea of the amount of damage that was done. Kari Boras, who is a health physicist and worked for the Pan American Health Organization, also helped a great deal. She even went down to El Salvador and inspected the physical facility where the accident had happened. And so it took a lot of people to go and study this case. I'm sad to say again that this individual first lost his legs and then died.
We've talked so far about your involvement with the emerging nuclear medicine techniques. We've talked about the special training that you were involved with from the very beginning. We've talked recently about the medical emergencies and the creation of REACTs. But as the Department of Energy's mission has evolved from then, from those disciplines, we've also seen more of a concern for environmental surveys. And I know that you were involved back in the early 1980s with the establishment of the Environmental Survey and Site Assessment Program.
Well, as the country's emphasis shifted and became more and more interested in environmental problems, we shifted also into doing environmental problems. We started out in a very small way doing mercury measurements in Oak Ridge and then uranium measurements in Oak Ridge. From that program, we started doing work outside of Oak Ridge for the Department of Energy at the FUSRAP sort of programs. That expanded into programs of verification for Nuclear Regulatory Commission and all that broad band of things that were going on. By the time we got done, we had people traveling all over the United States making measurements. This is just a little graph showing some of the places where people from ORAU had gone in order to make measurements. The type of measurements varied all the way from simple measurements with a survey meter to measurements that required taking samples from the core in all kinds of weather. And this program has continued to grow. It started in a small way, then Jim Berger, who's probably the most practical health physicist that I know, took over and expanded it into a more complete program, and that program is now being run by Jack Beck.
That's right. Well, Roger, as we get to the end of this interview, we spent a lot of time on talking about activities that I dare say that you got paid for. Now I would like to talk about a lot of the activities that you took on as a volunteer. Now I know that you were involved in the 1956 Health Physics Society meeting in Pittsburgh, and then a few years after that you came to Oak Ridge, and one of your discoveries was that at that time when you came to Oak Ridge there was not a local chapter. We now have the East Tennessee chapter of the Health Physics Society. So I understand you were instrumental in bringing about a local chapter here in Oak Ridge.
Well, first of all, one person doesn't do a lot. He needs lots of help. But it was a surprise when I came to Oak Ridge, the home of health physics with K.Z. Morgan and the large health physics division, to discover there wasn't a health physics chapter in the East Tennessee area. And so with the help of others, Joe Leonard and others, we organized a group into the East Tennessee chapter of the Health Physics Society. It actually was a very large chapter, for it had all the health physicists from the Oak Ridge National Lab. It had health physicists from Y-12, which incidentally is the place where the uranium-235 was enriched that was finally used in the Hiroshima bomb, and the people from K-25, the first gaseous diffusion plant to enrich uranium. With a background like that, we certainly had a big group, a very active group, a group where you could learn an awful lot from the individuals who attended it. But I'm happy to say that the chapter is still very, very active. There are lots of things going on. In fact, just recently, they produced T-shirts for the East Tennessee chapter, including its new logo. And so you can discover that if you attend chapter meetings, you may come home with a T-shirt, but more important, you come home with new friends and new information about professional health physics.
Roger, not only were you very instrumental in creating the East Tennessee chapter, but you've also been involved throughout your career with the National Health Physics Society. I understand that at one time you were the chair of the Publications Committee.
Well, after having served most of the positions on the East Tennessee chapter, I then decided I ought to help the National Society and learn more from the people who were spread across this country. So I served first on committees, ended up as chair of the Publications Committee, then ran for treasurer and was successful. Incidentally, I'm the first treasurer to raise the dues of the society, which incidentally, the dues were then and today still a very good bargain. But then I was elected president-elect and served as president-elect under President Charlie Mino, if you can remember, was my classmate and who I lived with in Brookhaven National Lab during my training there. And so this thing goes full cycle. When I became president, I'm most proud of the fact that it was during that period of time we created the power reactor section and the environmental section of the Health Physics Society.
So your involvement with both the East Tennessee chapter as well as the National Health Physics Society, as you mentioned, serving as the 27th president of the Health Physics Society, has allowed you to rub shoulders with quite a few health physicists.
Yes, I really think the Health Physics Society has done a great job. You get to meet lots of people who have similar problems to yours. You get to meet people who are trying to learn from you. In fact, I consider all the members of the Health Physics Society to be friends of mine, because I've never had a member of the Health Physics Society refuse to go and help me when I had a problem. But I do want to mention one health physicist that I knew in the Health Physics Society. He died several years ago. His name is Saul Harris. Now, Saul Harris has credit for being the very first person to recommend that a professional society of health physicists be formed. He did it in 1952 in a journal that was called Nucleonics. And so that's quite a credit to him. But he's also known as a member of the band called the Mutants. I have a small picture here of Saul Harris and his band that also include Joyce Davis, who's a member of the Health Physics Society, and several others. And they would do parodies on health physics and put them to songs that were familiar at that time. Saul did all kinds of things, very creative man. He also created this little button to save the Roentgen. Now that's a Lara from the beginning. Save a Roentgen. So Saul Harris deserves to be remembered. You can find him listed in the journal as one of the award winners in the early days. Eric, you've been asking me all the questions and asking about things I've done, but I want to take a moment to talk about something that you've done. You're known right now as being the author of this document, which is the Decommissioning Health Physics Handbook for MARSOM users. In my day, there wasn't such a thing as MARSOM, but I have looked at this document enough to know that you've done a very valuable piece of work for the health physics profession. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot, Roger. Well, Roger, you truly have had an outstanding career, both your professional career and all your volunteer activities, truly phenomenal. Just want to take a moment to reflect on the times that we are living in. As I mentioned early on, November 12, 2001, we're sitting here talking about a career of a fantastic health physicist. And we need to pause and just reflect on the fact that it's been just about 2 months since a real tragic event in our nation's history. It was September 11th at the terrorist bombing of World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the plane that went down in Pennsylvania have really helped put the hazards of radiation into a clearer perspective, that we live in a world that has many hazards, not just from radiation. And those of us who have decided to make the radiation protection field our career always need to be cognizant of the fact that there's many hazards, and we deal expertly with just one of those hazards. Roger, it's been a pleasure to do this interview. I know that you've retired. 1992, I believe, was your last official day. I didn't even start work here until 1993, and I know I've seen you my entire career, so you've really never retired in my mind. And I know that you're having a fantastically good time in your retirement. If I might just show this picture here. Here's Roger and his family enjoying a lighter moment with the grandchildren.